we're in Lamed Beis and Beis, 32b. We didn't go any further since last time you're here. It's been a little while. Yesterday there was no classes. Friday there wasn't. Okay, so we're discussing here is an interesting teaching from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He discusses instances when a person should make known what he's going through versus when someone should not make known what he's going through. That's what was being discussed here. So when, this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's teaching, when making known what you're going through is going to elicit from others prayer to help you, then do so. Person's going through some sort of stress in life, God forbid. So let it be known and people can pray for you. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai used that model to explain why someone who has the saras, someone who has that skin discoloration is being excommunicated. So as he's taken out, he's pronounced as being impure. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai explained the reason is that others can see him and pray for him. If it is, on the other hand, the flip side, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said that prayer is to be done in an undertone. As I mentioned, that the Gemara elsewhere says that the reason why we pray in undertone is because praying out loud is like behaving as if God doesn't hear you. It's mekatne amuna. It's like someone lacking faith thinks God doesn't hear him unless he screams. So the Gemara elsewhere says that's the reason for undertone prayer. Michael Chernick is gonna like when I say it's silent prayer because it's not silent, it's undertone. Silent prayer sounds like you're not supposed to be verbalizing it. It's good. It's a good point. But here, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says the reason for undertone prayer is not to embarrass the one who sins. Namely, someone else sinned and in their prayer are going to confess. And if everybody's praying aloud, then they'll be able to hear what is his prayer. We're able to hear his sin. So it's not to embarrass him. Everybody does an undertone prayer. Sorry?
Like you said, it's 11 months versus 12 months.
How do you mean?
In so far as we don't say 12 months because that was a real Russia, no?
Right, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, the reason why everybody does 11 months because that's the max. Mm-hmm. Even someone who's a tzaddik who doesn't need the same kind of cleansing will still say Kaddish the whole thing, just not to separate between Jews. Mm-hmm. As if, oh, my parent is a tzaddik, so I'm only saying Kaddish for 2 months. Equal for everybody, yeah. So which almost sounds like.
So why we during the Kedusha, we out loud?
Well, during the Kedusha, there's no point at which you would insert your confession. It's only during the Amidah, during the part of, during that blessing where you talk about your sin, that's where you would add a confession.
Okay.
Right. But what it seems like from Shimon Bar Yochai then is that in essence, prayer aloud is a good thing. Maybe because it inspires enthusiasm. There's some Hasidic circles where they specifically pray out loud. Stalin, Karlin, they scream their prayers out loud, literally scream. If you've ever been to such a shul.
There's shuls in Israel where they actually sit and sing for like 2 or 3 hours.
Okay, so the Sephardim do that, but that's not the Amidah.
Okay.
That's all the other things. When we say prayer, it means specifically the halachic prayer, which is the Amidah. Mm-hmm. Even in the Sephardic communities where they'll say the whole thing aloud, which is a beautiful thing, because every kid knows the whole prayer by heart because they chant the whole thing essentially. But the Amidah they'll still do silently. In Karlin Stalin, they scream their prayers, literally scream it, and everything, and it creates an environment of really like you're compelled by the environment to be invested in your prayer. It's not the Chabad way, but it is a way. Anyway, from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, what emerged that actually allowed prayer is good, but each individual forgoes the better version of their prayer so as not to embarrass someone who's sinning, which is a very deep lesson in love your fellow Jew, right? Sort of degrade, quote unquote, your prayer on a personal level for the sake of not embarrassing someone else. Now, Rabbi Gipel emailed me about another instance in which we would publicize someone's misdeed. And that's, it's baked into the law of capital punishment, that it be made known. And in that instance, as Rabbi Gipel noted, it's probably because of deterrent. That's part of the point of capital punishment, that to be deterrent. There is another instance in which public pronouncement of sin is a virtue. That is under certain circumstances with regard to Teshuva. So we did once a series here on the laws of Teshuva from the Rambam, and there we discussed it, exactly when and how and why and where. So I'm not going to go there now, and it's not all sin, and it's not all the time, but certain sins under certain circumstances, proclaiming it publicly, depending which public, how and why, is a virtue. And sorry. Yeah. So to do this properly, we'd have to look up the source of that and see if Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has an opinion there, because here we're quoting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Nonetheless, I'm confessing here that I did not do that, but nonetheless, perhaps the distinction between the prayer where we're doing it in an undertone, so as not to embarrass the one who's going to sin and who's going to confess his sins in prayer, versus the fact that elsewhere with regard to Teshuva, at least under certain circumstances, confessing prayer publicly, confessing sinning publicly is a virtue. Like, what's the distinction? So two things can be said, two things that are related to really one. First of all, when it comes to Teshuva and the virtue of publicly stating one's sin, that's on the person who's doing Teshuva's terms. So when that person's ready, if they see it's necessary and if whatever the circumstances are, it's right for them, they'll do it. But I can't impose on someone else if they do that because it's a virtue. And therefore my prayer is going to be an undertone because maybe he doesn't want to proclaim a sin. Even if it's better for him to, he doesn't want to. I'm going to compel him because it's a virtue. That's distinction A. Even though, follow what I'm saying, even though if on the individual level, there's a virtue for that particular person to proclaim a sin, it's not my job to compel him to do that. And on the contrary, I'm going to pray in an undertone so he doesn't have to do that. Right? That's number one. Number two is, even with respect to the person himself, what really is the point in the public admission of sin? Right? Now, I'm not talking about it in the sense of banging on the table and saying, hi, everybody, I did X, Y, Z sins. But even just the comfortability to speak about it in public or amongst friends or others. So perhaps the depth of that idea is that it truly indicates that you've moved past the sin. That's in essence what Teshuva is. A person says, the guy who did those is not me anymore. I'm a new person. That's what Teshuva really is, right? It's not about, evening out the checks and balances. That's not what it's about. That's a mistaken conception of Teshuva. Teshuva is a very forward-looking motion. That guy's not me anymore. I'm a new person, right? Now, if a person carries a sense of shame about their past activity, it's a very healthy thing. I think there's nothing wrong with feeling shame about that past, transgression or mistake or whatnot. That's a perfectly healthy thing. But so long as the person still holds on to that shame, it means that activity still has a hold on them. They haven't let go of it yet and moved past it yet. And when they've come to the point of comfortability to be able to speak it publicly, then you've moved past it. Now, following? Now, if that's the story, then actually the shame is required first. Because if a person never has the shame of sin and just always talks about it publicly, it's not a virtue. It's not a virtue. On the contrary, it means the person is careless about the sin. And the point of declaring it publicly is not because I'm careless about it, but because I moved past it. And I'm only moved past it if I've truly accepted and lived the shame of that activity. But now I've grown to the point where I'm not that person anymore. And therefore I can talk about what the old Levi used to do.
Not even as a function of deterrent?
No, it's part of the Teshuva. Not a function of deterrent. I'm not proclaiming any punishment I received. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I've used this analogy, if you remember in the past, where I said, let's say, you lend me your car.
Yeah.
Right? And I smashed your car.
Yeah.
And you tell me, don't worry about it. It's insured.
Yeah.
I'm actually getting a brand new car. I'm actually happy you smashed my car because now I got full replacement value. I'm getting, but so when I make Teshuva,
Yeah.
and Hashem is going to erase all my sins, I will always walk around knowing that I smashed your car. Even though you forgive me, and I even got a better car now, I got a newer car with new technology because I'm fully insured. But in my head, I know always will, every time I look at you, I know I smashed your.
Yeah,
car.
so because I'm not God.
No, but
No, and I mean that because I don't have, if I was truly magnanimous and had the real value of being able to let go of it, then maybe you wouldn't see that way. I'll tell you a personal story about that. I'm not gonna get the whole details, but my grandfather once gave me a very serious personal shot for not saying thank you to him for something I did. That's something he did for me. I'm sorry, I didn't say thank you properly. The circumstances were such that I didn't get to verbalize my thank you because my grandmother was talking to me and just didn't come out. But that's not the point. I'm excusing myself already. The point is, he gave me a shot. Anyway, a day or two later, I sent him an email like in the middle of the night, like I can't sleep, I can't believe it, and that I ditched your thing and yada yada. This is my father's father, and he wrote back like, God forbid, never meant to cause any sleepless nights. All is forgiven and forgotten. And the next time I saw him, I really felt that. And there's never an awkwardness after that.
no.
Because as a grandparent, he's truly capable of letting go of whatever he hurt, So if I had that ability to do, you may not feel so. I still remember, of course, that I failed in that regard. But I don't carry a sense of shame about it, and I'm scared to face my grandfather because I once did that, right? Because we moved past it, which is the point here. If I didn't care to begin with, and it never caused me any sleepless nights, you just I didn't say thank you, okay, bye. Right? That's not a virtue. It's a serious problem. You should feel a sense of serious remorse if your grandfather tells you off for not saying thank you. Right. But then, because of my grandfather's magnanimity, I was able to. Exactly. So both of these stages are necessary, right? Starting off with a sense of like, I'm embarrassed to see my grandfather again because I really failed him. And then getting to a point where, you know what, we really moved past it. I have no feelings of any strain when I see him because.
But you'll always have that memory.
The memory's at the point. It's like, your memory's amazing.
That's what I'm trying to explain to you. That I'll always remember I smashed your car. Don't feel bad about it. Not walking around with egg on my face for the rest of my life.
Right, but the memory is relevant. Why is the memory relevant?
The memory is relevant because otherwise, then what was the point?
Sorry,
You'll always have that memory. No, you're not going to have that. You don't have that shame anymore, but you always have.
Okay, so we were talking about shame and public guilt. Right, the memory stays.
The memory stays. Exactly.
Good. I'm not saying the memory doesn't. That's not the point. I'm making this point that there's this idea of publicly confessing has a certain context. It's not as if every person who publicly confesses is virtuous. Sometimes they're just careless, and sometimes they're just being foolish. Right? There's a very specific process. And considering that, it's not for me to decide where the other person is in this process. And therefore, I'm going to pray in an undertone. Maybe he's not ready to publicly confess what he did. And that's why I'm going to pray in undertone. I'm just trying to reconcile these two things. Whereas Rabbi Shimon is saying, pray in undertone so the person doesn't publicly. Whereas elsewhere we see it's a virtue in publicly confessing. So I'm just explaining how these two things jive, and they're not a contradiction. On the contrary, they complement each other. And it's on each person on their own to decide when they're ready to publicly confess, not for me. And it's not as if the person should publicly confess right away and it's a virtuous thing. If you did that, it means you didn't care. Right? And therefore, pray in undertone, because maybe he's not ready for anybody to know what he did. When he gets there, if and when he'll decide to go public. It's not for me to do that. And therefore, pray in undertone, as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai prescribes, so as not to embarrass the one who might confess to God. In essence, he's ready to confess to God, but he's not ready to confess to everybody else. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, sometimes I think the choice whether or not to go public with your sin is not even up to you. For instance, in Saras, you're afflicted with Saras, and you may not have been in a place where you wanted to publicly reveal your shortcomings and.
But God does it to you. Yeah.
It may be.
So there are sources
But
also.
it may just be an acceleration of you doing Teshuva.
Right. So there is source for that, where God puts in a person in a position where he's publicly outed, so as to propel his Teshuva. That does exist, right? That's not what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says here. Here, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that the reason why he pronounced it Saras publicly is that other people pray for him.
So that's some of the other.
Sorry, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's. It seems like the undergirding thinking of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is that public or keeping things public or private is related to Avos Yisrael. if there's going to be a virtue of love of your fellow Jew and publicly claiming it because it's going to cause people to pray for you for public. If it's just going to embarrass someone, then stay quiet. That seems to be the thread of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's thinking. Even though, again, as I said elsewhere, there are other angles given to the same discussion. As with prayer, when it comes to prayer, elsewhere the Gemara doesn't say the reason why you're silent is because of not embarrassing. The reason you're silent is because this is the better version of your relationship with God. That's what the Gemara says elsewhere. But here, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai seems to say it might be better for you to pray loud, but don't because of your love of a fellow Jew. And similarly, he explains why the Tzardas is publicly declared is to invoke others to pray on behalf of him. Right? So it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's unique, seemingly, approach. Right? So, which is why, again, to do this right, we have to go back to the Teshuva discussion and see what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says there. But either way, I'm just giving this reconciliation nonetheless, because I think it's true. Okay, clear? All right, so we're middle of the page. The line begins with the word rachamim, and the second word is gufa. It's the middle, on the base, on the base, the other side, 32b. Middle of the line begins with the word rachamim, middle of the page. Second word is gufa. Oh, you see it? There, yeah, there it is, right there. Yeah, that's it. See it? Gufa, right there. Okay, gufa. Gufa literally means the body, meaning the body of the text you just raised. This is the Gemara's way of revisiting a text that it raised tangentially to discuss it itself. So this discussion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was raised in connection with the Mishnah. The Mishnah was discussing the person who comes to the temple to declare that he fulfilled all his obligation of tithe, who does so in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's view. Well, the Mishnah said it can be done in any language. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's view, he says that should be done in an undertone because it's self-aggrandizement. You're discussing how you fulfilled your obligation. Whereas Bikurim, when a person comes and thanks God for the new fruit, and there he declares how our ancestors were put through stress, that he should be done publicly because stresses are to be shared publicly so others can pray for you. Right? So in that context, the Gemara quoted Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who said that a person should pray silently so as not to embarrass the one who wants to confess his sin to God. So that statement is tangential to the original discussion. So when the Gemara wants to revisit the text that you raised tangentially, it will say the word gufa, gufa, to the body of the text itself that you just raised. Let's now analyze that. So gufa, in the text earlier, we said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Quote, why is it that our sages established that the prayer should be done in an undertone? Said Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, not to embarrass the one who sins. If he decides to confess his prayer to God, it's not on us to make him say it loudly so somebody else hears. So as not to embarrass him, let him speak to God privately, and we'll all talk to God privately. What was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's proof for this idea? Right, because the sages are the ones that established prayer in an undertone. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is applying logic to that establishment, and he's relying on the verse to support that reasoning. Namely, Shaharei, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai explains, for we find that Leichala Kakosov, the verse does not differentiate Makkah, the location, in Chatas La'olam. As we read every morning in our, just before Haidu, the section called Ezeo Mukaiman, we go in detail the precise location of each offering in the temple. So by looking at the location of where the Kohen is standing at the time of the slaughtering, east, west, north, to the right, to the left, you can tell what type of offering it is. So says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Torah specifically puts the sin offering and the burnt offering in the same location. So as that when someone sees me hand off a offering to the priest, and then he takes it to a certain place to slaughter it, everybody watching doesn't know,
Right.
well, is this person doing it because he's gratefully bringing to God a burnt offering, or is he doing it because he has some sin? So we see we're equating the guy who has a perfect offering to the imperfect offering, so it's not embarrassing. So likewise, in prayer, the person who's confessing in prayer versus the person who's just offering a prayer to God should do so silently so that nobody knows the difference between the two.
They can't see what's being offered.
So that's what Gemara is going to get to now. The law, and there's no way to differentiate between one offering and another offering. That's it, just location. There are other ways of differentiating. There is where the blood is placed on the altar. Dam chatas. Lamaila. The offering, the blood of the offering, of the sin offering, is put on the altar above. There was like a, what's it called? Like a ring.
I don't know what it's called. I think it's like a red line, midpoint line.
Yeah. The Hebrew word is the circa. But there was a line in the middle of it's like a ring that went around the altar. And the sin offering, the blood had to be poured above that line. But for dam oila, the blood of the perfect burnt offering, not the sin offering, is done below, lamata. Below. So there's other ways of differentiating.
Then there's also blood on the horns, the sin offering, right?
I think they're both on all the horns.
Really? Even the Orla? Those are the sin offering.
Kana is right. Oh, so the corners means it goes above. That's what Rashi tells us. Because it says corners, therefore it means above the line.
Corners of the wall, so it hits two walls. You hit two corners.
That's you hit two corners at once, right? But the question is above or below.
Yeah.
Okay. So he says the Gemara. Okay, so there's another way of differentiating between the sin offering and the burnt offering. So Yudah Rishim Bar relying on location to indicate that we treat them equally, so no one should know. But there are other ways of differentiating. Says the Gemara, but Hassam, there with respect to location of the blood, Kayan hu diyada. It's only the Kayan who knows. Nobody else knows. Now, Gemara doesn't explain. And then Rashi says, there's no embarrassment there, because only the Kayan knows what he's bringing. Nobody else.
It's kind of like when you have the tzedakah box. You don't know who put what in for what reason.
Yeah. So the question then becomes, well, why isn't he embarrassed by the Kayan? Gemara doesn't address that.
What's the question? Sorry.
Why isn't he embarrassed of the Kayan? Or why are we concerned with the Kayan
Why
knowing?
are we concerned with the embarrassment when only the Kohen?
The Kayan knows, right? Well, the Kayan knows. Isn't that embarrassing? Every time he sees the Kayan, he's going to be embarrassed about his offering. Gemara doesn't address that. But perhaps, as we know, as Chassidus explains, Kayan ish chesed. The Kayan is the embodiment of kindness and compassion.
At least during the first temple.
That ought to be. And indeed, Never points this out. The halacha is, we spoke about saras earlier, with a person who has the afflicted with the skin discoloration as a result of spiritual affliction is to leave the community. So the halacha is, the Kayan has to pronounce him to be impure. So even if the Kayan is ignorant, as you come to a town, the only Kayan in town is ignorant, doesn't know the laws. But there's a local rabbi who does know the laws. So the rabbi goes through the whole thing. He's the one that determines he's either saras or not saras, but he can't pronounce him impure. The Kayan has to do it. What for? So explains the Rebbe, because if you're going to exact such a harsh punishment of excommunication, that it better come from a very deep place of compassion and empathy. That's the Kayan embodies. It's ultimate compassion and empathy, even for the sinner. He said, my dear friend, I wish I could help you, but you have to. The law is you have to go out. It's going to hurt him when he says you got to go out, not just willy-nilly. Yeah, you're a sinner, get out.
I think he would even
So specifically, the Kayan has to do that.
I think the Kohen would even hold off on pronouncing if there was a young child coming up or something.
There's all kinds of laws around that. Yeah. So perhaps then here too, the compassionate Kayan, he's the one that can know about someone else's, what's going on with someone else, because he's the kind of person who won't, look in the eyes of the other person and communicate through his eyes. I know what you did. That's the kind of person he is. He's not a Kayan. Kayan is forgiving in that regard. That's what the Kayan is. That's what he ought to be. That's what he symbolizes. So perhaps that's why the Gemara is okay. Mishimbar is okay with the Kayan knowing. And indeed, moreover, I might add that sometimes sharing it with someone like that is very helpful. It unburdens the person. The person feels burdened. He feels like he's alone carrying this weight. But you have someone who's non-judgmentally compassionate, can hear what your person did, it helps to unburden the person. So it's a favor to the person. And at least the kohen knows that he's not a sin offering. So that this compassionate person can help carry the burden of what he's walking around with. So perhaps the kohen knowing is not just not a problem, but actually beneficial. Perhaps. The Gemara quotes the verse elsewhere. The person who has a worry in his heart, he should share it with another. You share it with another who's compassionate, helps you carry that burden. So perhaps the kohen knowing is actually helpful too. So
And hence the Kohen can pray for him.
the kohen can pray, exactly, go back to the point of the thing, the kohen can pray for him, that's right.
We're not talking about a singular Kohen, right? We're talking about all that are on.
I understand, I'm talking about what the kohen
No, I
symbolizes.
was asking, I wasn't sure.
Oh, the singular kohen who's on duty would know, nobody else would know.
No, but all the other Kohen who are on duty that would also.
If they happen to be watching what he's doing, they might also, the other kohen might know.
They're not doing everything. They're
But
not-
I imagine only the kohen is actually performing that service with them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, unless there's another kohen standing there watching him go like this and then watching him walk to the altar, because he's got to go from one place to
He's got-
slaughter,
there's a
and then he's got to
slaughter.
walk over to the altar, right? So unless someone's standing there and watching what he's doing, only the kohen himself knows.
So he's pouring the blood, he's.
Yeah, or the one or two kohen, however many are doing the offering. It's possible other kohen could watch, but I imagine that kohen weren't standing around the temple unless they were busy doing something. Gemara goes further. But we have another differentiation between sin offering and the burnt offering. The sin offering is female, whereas the burnt offering is male. The Gemara says Hassam, but in that case, we're not concerned because michse ba'alya, the tail covers up the differentiation of the gender, of the sex of the offering. So it's true, it's a different animal, but it's concealed, exactly like the prayer. Two people are praying different prayers, but it's concealed by silence, by undertone. So two different offerings, but concealed. Further, the Gemara says, Tinach kivsa se'ira. Tinach kivsa. This is only true if they're bringing a sheep, in which the tail can cover the sex of the animal. But se'ira, if they're bringing a goat, which apparently doesn't have the same kind of concealment. I am not a farmer, so I don't know. Michael Maymar, what can you say there?
Well, the goat would have horns. It's a male.
Oh, so there you go. So then you would differentiate right away between male and female. Thank you. See, there you go.
Sorry, I missed that.
The goat would have horns if it's a male.
And actually just says there is no tail to cover the
Gender.
to cover the thing. But
I think that maybe only if it's over a year, right?
it actually seems to be saying it's only by the feminine. Okay, so the tail covers the female genitalia, but by the goat it doesn't. And you're right, the horns are only if it's over a certain age, whereas this would be under.
That's a ram.
Good point.
It's
That's
over
right.
a year.
That's right.
Or a sheep.
That's right. Says the Gemara, okay, Hassam, in this case, we're not concerned with that because he's the one that decided to publicly declare his own sin because the boiler he could have brought a sheep instead of the goat. He's doing that. He did it himself, right? He could have brought the sheep and had it concealed, but he decided to bring a goat. This perhaps goes to our earlier point, which is if this person in Teshuva decides is at the point where he wants people to know what he's doing, okay, so he can choose to bring a Seder, and therefore we're not going to stop him from publicly declaring what he wants to declare. But we give him the option that if he wants to, conceal it. Perhaps like we were discussing earlier, the silent prayer versus the Teshuva. Okay. Further, the Gemara says, but chatas the Ovid Chavim, the sin offering of a non-Jew, right? No, sorry, the sin offering of someone who did idol worship. The loy sagi the lav seira. It must be a goat. Michael and Memar, what are you going to say there? It has to be a goat. Everybody's going to know what he did. Says the Gemara Hassam. In that instance, nichsif and nizal. Let him be embarrassed. Because such a grave sin needs a serious cleansing, so let him be embarrassed. It's to his favor that he be publicly embarrassed for the kind of sin of idol worship. So this concludes our discussion on the question of public or private declaration of one's circumstances. And tomorrow, God willing, we get back to the list of things that the Mishnah said can be done in any language. There's a whole list of things the Gemara said you can do in any language. And those lists of things that we said you have to do only in the original Hebrew. When it came to the original Hebrew, the Mishnah itself began to tell us, based on the verses, how we know it has to be done in the original Hebrew. The next Mishnah will continue that list and tell us how we know that has to be done in the original Hebrew. But the Mishnah did not tell us any verses that indicate that you can do the other list in any language. The Sotah, the Videmaisa, the Bukhar. But the Gemara is going to do that. So tomorrow, God willing, we'll continue going through that list of things that can be said in any language. First on our list, Shema. God willing, tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, Eden.